I have said this before, but I shall say it again and again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war.
We'll be singing hallelujah, marching through Berlin. We'll be singing hallelujah, marching through Berlin.
Never before, since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Frankly and definitely, there is danger ahead. Danger against which we must prepare.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
He was a famous trumpet man from out Chicago way. He had a boogie style that no one else could play. He was the South man at his class. But then his number came up and he was gone with the draft. He's in the army now, a blowing reveille. He's the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order.
New world order.
You saw?
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the best. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
We can keep it. Period. They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.D. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 007, FDR and the Attack on Pearl Harbor. Our guest is Doug Horne, author of the 2-volume Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War, which can be purchased at MidnightRiderNews.com, oh by the way. But first, a little cleaning of the castle. In trying to make it easier for you to locate the full archives of the show, we've now added a new link at the top of MidnightRiderNews.com. You'll see that the link just says Archives. When you click on the Archives link, you'll see a tersely constructed list of each episode. When you click on the episode number, it'll take you directly to that episode in the archives. So every show we've done so far should be really easy to find. You can now still download or listen to the show. We recommend downloading if you do not have constant Wi-Fi access. And yes, we're still available on iTunes and many other providers. Let me tell you all that I'm really excited to have Doug Horne on the show tonight. He was not easy to find, and he doesn't do a lot of interviews. He has a wealth of knowledge on the issue of Pearl Harbor, and he'll show you tonight why he firmly believes that FDR had foreknowledge and coerced the Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor as a way to enter World War II, which had previously been an unpopular war for most Americans. Doug Horne has a presentation that is detailed and as close to airtight as can be on this topic. His presentation is lengthy, however, and I made an editorial decision to spend a majority of the interview listening and learning from an expert in the field, so that's what I will do. Most of what you hear tonight will be a masterful presentation on FDR and Pearl Harbor. I'll ask a few questions towards the end, and this is not a show to be missed. So we'll be right back with FDR and the Attack on Pearl Harbor. How much did Richard Nixon know about the Watergate break-in? Was the Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post really heroic in its uncovering of the Watergate affair? What roles were really played by Alexander Haig and John Dean? And what's this about a call girl ring linked to it all? If you want to hear the story of how Richard Nixon was brought down by a silent coup, listen to episode 003 of the Midnight Rider News Show and allow Lynn Kalodny to tell you how Watergate really happened.
This is Lynn Kalodny. You're listening to Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Douglas P. Horne grew up in a military family. His father was in the Marine Corps and graduated cum laude from The Ohio State University with a BA in history in 1974. He spent 20 years working for the U.S. Navy in various capacities, 10 years on active duty as a surface warfare officer and 10 more years as a Navy civil servant. Doug spent over 14 years of his Navy service in Hawaii. He served on 3 U.S. Navy destroyers homeported in Pearl Harbor from 1976 to 1981. He was the operations manager in a Navy field office in Pearl Harbor from 1985 to 1995. Doug opted for a major career shift when he relocated to Washington, D.C. in 1995 to assume his position on the staff of the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board, the ARRB. As head of the military records team on the ARRB, Doug oversaw the release of significant historical documents related to U.S. policy on Cuba and Vietnam during the Kennedy years, and he was the principal research assistant for the ARRB General Counsel during the Review Board's crucial deposition of 10 key JFK autopsy witnesses. Mr. Horne retired from federal service in 2016 after working at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum for 2 years, and after completing his civil service career by working with the U.S. State Department's Passport Division for the final 14 years of his 40-year federal career. Doug is the author of 3 books. The 5-volume Inside the Assassination Records Review Board about the U.S. government's cover-up of the medical evidence of the JFK assassination, the e-book JFK's War with the National Security Establishment, Why Kennedy Was Assassinated, and his most recent work, Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War, about FDR and Pearl Harbor, was published this year. So tonight, we welcome Doug Horne to the Midnight Rider News Show. Doug, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being on the show.
It's my pleasure. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I'm very impressed with your website, and I'm proud to be an early contributor to your program.
So, Doug, the stage is 1941, and we're approximately 2 years into World War II. What led Japan and the United States to this point when the attack on Pearl Harbor occurs?
Well, ST, that's the driving question behind my new book, Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. How did this war between Japan and America occur? What kicked it off? What were the underlying causes? Because one thing I noticed over the years is that whenever I watch a mainstream documentary, whether it's one on PBS about FDR or one on the History Channel about FDR, or even the Ken Burns documentary about the Roosevelts, they'll spend a lot of time talking about FDR's domestic policy. They'll spend some time talking about what was going on in Europe and Hitler in the beginning of World War II in Europe. And they never talk about the war between Japan and America. They never talk about how it even started. All of a sudden they just say, oh, and this happened. And then the United States entered World War II. And it's just actually shameful that they take this shallow approach. So what they've done is taken a intentionally shallow and non-controversial approach to a very controversial subject. So what I would like to do in the way of answering your question is begin by discussing FDR's core values and what kind of a person he was and what kind of a politician he was and what kind of a chief executive he was, and then place your audience into the context of what was happening in Europe from 1939 through December 1941. So what was happening in Europe and what was Roosevelt's response to that, and what were his goals in response to the Nazi subjugation of Europe as our relationship with Japan began to deteriorate, because it did deteriorate considerably from about mid-1940 through December of 1941. And I'll be talking about that. But what was happening in Europe, ST, and what FDR's goals in regard to Europe and the war over there materially affected how he was handling the Japan problem. And we'll be getting into that very soon. So I think the best place to start, before I answer your question directly, is to just talk about FDR and what kind of a person he was and what kind of a president he was.
All right, let's do
so
that.
I'll begin with what I call FDR's core values. And I'm going to list 6 topics that I consider, 6 attributes that I consider the overriding ones. And the first one is that he was indeed a champion of the common man. He was a patrician. He was a person born to wealth and privilege, and yet, in spite of that, he was a champion of the common man, and this is one of the reasons he was so hated by other people of position and wealth, and why he was considered a traitor to his class by many of the people from upstate New York, where he was from. He was a strong advocate of human rights and individual freedoms. He also strongly supported free trade and self-determination for all peoples, and actually despised the British Empire, colonialism, and mercantilism, which made it even more remarkable, by the way, that he ended up being such a staunch supporter of Winston Churchill, in spite of his dislike of the British Empire. FDR was a Wilsonian internationalist, which means that he believed in the interdependency of modern nations and in avoiding war through engagement with other leaders and other governments. And because he was an internationalist, he strongly opposed isolationism. And the problem that he had was that he became president in 1933 of an isolationist nation. The United States had rejected membership, declined membership in the League of Nations, even though President Wilson had created the League of Nations after World War I, a means of collective security in Europe and trying to resolve disputes without major wars. The American Senate rejected that, and we had become an isolationist nation. So he paid occasional lip service to isolationism from 1935 to 1939, but it wasn't the real FDR. He paid lip service when he thought he had to, such as when the Congress passed neutrality acts, which forbade American ships and industries from selling arms and transporting them to belligerents, such as when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939 and kicked off World War II. He made the appropriate isolationist noises, we're not going to get in the war, but that's not really how he felt about it. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I would say the last point I would want to make is that he strongly opposed fascism. And so that would mean he opposed Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, and also Imperial Japan. I would not call Imperial Japan a fascist nation in the true sense, because they did not have a one-man dictator government. They had a consensus rule by military cliques,
right,
backed up by an emperor. But they weren't strictly fascist countries, but their bloodlust was just as great, if not greater, than those of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. So he opposed fascism and imperialism. So what kind of a person was FDR? And that's the first thing I think we need to understand as we approach this subject. Most people, let's say people who have not read biographies of FDR, probably view him as our avuncular uncle, a nice guy, occasionally funny, occasionally a little bit tricky, but just a nice guy, and they don't know much more about him. So I'm going to give you some wonderful quotes from some accomplished historians who have written biographies of FDR. And one of them that I like is that his personality demonstrated, quote, bewildering complexity, end quote. He could be bold or cautious, informal or dignified, cruel or kind, intolerant or long-suffering, urbane or rustic, impetuous or temporizing, and here's the key word, and Machiavellian on occasion. We'll get into that in a minute. FDR was always performing. He once told the actor Orson Welles, who was probably the foremost radio actor in America in 1938 and 39, he once told Orson Welles that they were, quote, the two greatest actors in America, end quote, namely himself, the president, and Orson Welles. Here's another interesting quote. Harry Truman, after FDR's death, said that, quote, "He was the coldest man I ever met. He didn't give a damn personally for me or you or anyone else in the world as far as I could see, but he was a great president. He brought this country into the 20th century," end quote. So that's Harry Truman, a man who only began to know Roosevelt in the last year of his life when he was made the vice presidential candidate by the party, and who didn't meet with FDR that often. So this is the view of Truman, who probably didn't know him as well as a lot of other people. But that's the impression he got near the end of FDR's life. Here's my favorite quote. It's from columnist Walter Lippmann, who was a big newspaper columnist in this country for almost 40 years, starting in the 1930s. Here's the quote. "Roosevelt was a wonderful finagler. He loved to take a complicated thing which involved a certain amount of deception, hornswoggling of people, and somehow get it done." That's the quote. That's a heck of a quote. And there's a historian who writes today, John Meacham, who's writing books as we speak.
Right.
He wrote a famous book called Franklin and Winston about Roosevelt and Churchill. He's just written one on Andrew Jackson.
Right.
Historian John Meacham wrote that one of Roosevelt's personal faults, his duplicity, was sometimes a political virtue. So here's the quote. Quote, "What could make Roosevelt a trying husband and a frustrating friend could make him a great president. Sometimes politicians have to pursue different courses at the same time and deceive those closest to them about what they are doing," end quote. So ultimately the inner FDR, I conclude, was detached. This is the inner FDR, detached, impenetrable, and enigmatic, ultimately a sphinx to almost everyone around him. His management style was extremely close to the vest. He rarely, if ever, revealed his innermost thoughts to anyone. So to his credit, FDR tolerated dissent and a wide range of opinions amongst his cabinet members and his advisors. But he kept the reins of power very tightly in his own hands. He strongly discouraged note-taking by cabinet members at meetings. He was described as by historian Ian Kershaw as, quote, "a shrewd and capable politician," end quote, who often accomplished goals through patience, wariness, and roundabout means. He was described as devious and duplicitous by his enemies, admired for his cleverness and political maneuvering by his supporters, and was described as elusive and dissembling by historian Waldo Heinrichs. And ultimately, he focused on ends and not means. So I think the picture your audience should have by now is that FDR had a multifaceted personality,
yes,
and was a man of many faces, and that's the truth.
Absolutely.
So I think it's greatly ironic that in the pursuit of ends, consistent with his altruistic core values, FDR could employ means that were devious and duplicitous, elusive and dissembling, and manipulative at times. And there's one word that sums up those traits, and that would be the word Machiavellian, which I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
The most famous quote I'd like to read about Roosevelt's personality is something he said about himself. That's why it's just such a wonderful quote. It's from March of 1942.
Okay.
And I call the quote The Juggler. I got this off of a PBS documentary about FDR a couple of decades ago, and then looked it up later and made sure that he really said that. He said this in March 1942 to a cabinet member, Henry Morgenthau, who was Secretary of the Treasury. And here's the quote. "You know I am a juggler, and I never let my right hand know what my left hand does. I am perfectly willing to mislead and tell untruths if it will help win the war."
Wow.
Wow, yeah. Now, Roosevelt said this after we were in the war in March 1942, 4 months after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. But I think this is representative of his attitude from the moment that Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. I think this is representative of his attitude the whole time. It wasn't just suddenly, it didn't just suddenly become his attitude in March 42. So I think the thing to hit next is once World War II started, which is commonly recognized by historians as September 1st, 39, when Hitler invaded Poland, is what was Roosevelt's reaction, and what were his goals? What were his principal war aims as a president leading an isolationist nation who didn't want to get involved in any more European wars? And I think his goals were, number one, to do all he could to stop fascism in Nazi Germany and Europe. Now, this problem became a lot more urgent in the spring of 1940, when Germany launched its gigantic offensive against Western Europe. So, Germany gobbled up Poland in about 6 weeks. They took the western half of Poland, and they had made a secret deal with the Soviet Union, with their traditional enemy, the Stalin's communist government, and made a deal where Stalin was allowed to have the eastern half of Poland. And so during that period of time, while Hitler was still, at least on the surface, and if not an ally of Joseph Stalin, they agreed to be, they signed a non-aggression pact, which meant we'll split Poland in half and we won't attack each other right now. That's basically what that deal meant. So he launched his big assault on the West, and in a very short space of time, let me back off a bit. In April 1940, Hitler suddenly invaded Norway and Denmark, and the world was stunned with the rapidity with which that was accomplished. And then the next month, in May, the big assault was launched on Germany's number one enemy, especially from World War I, France. So in May 1940, Germany invaded France and the Netherlands and Belgium, and all at the same time. And the entire British Army at that time was on the continent, helping defend Belgium. And the French had their Maginot Line, which they thought would defend them, a series of static fortresses. And within less than 6 weeks, the British Army had been completely defeated and kicked off the continent of Europe. They escaped, most of their soldiers escaped because of the big evacuation at Dunkirk, but without any weapons. Most of them didn't even have their rifles anymore. They certainly didn't have any of their tanks or artillery. They had to leave that behind. And France had fallen and capitulated. And, of course, the Netherlands and Belgium didn't stand up very long. So at that point, Roosevelt's goal, his number one goal, became to do all he could to prevent Great Britain from being defeated, because he properly saw this as a threat to Western civilization, Nazi Germany, and so he began to try to educate the American people through a series of major speeches, and to try to educate the Congress about the fact that it's really not safe to be isolationist anymore. We can't just declare that America is first, and that's where that term originated, by the way, was with the America First movement in 1940. Led by Charles Lindbergh and others. Right. He said, American first is not good enough. The oceans will not protect us anymore in the age of the submarine, the battleship, and the airplane. He said, we shouldn't have this illusion that we're protected by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. So his goal, certainly in May, number one, was to rearm as quickly as possible. So defense spending, at his urging, jumped 5 times in May 1940. He got Congress to approve a 5 times increase in defense spending. I mean, that boggles the mind when you think about it. But that's what happened, because the panic was really on then. Once France fell and the British Army was kicked off of Europe, and it was only Great Britain standing up against Germany, and Germany was astride the rest of the continent, the panic was on. So he began to try to educate the public with speeches, and he developed this policy of giving all material aid short of war to Great Britain. And he slowly but surely sold that to Congress and to the American people. It took him a while, but I'll just 2 very quick points. He finally did what Churchill wanted on September 2nd, 1940. He traded 50 old American destroyers from World War I, which had been in mothballs, 50 American destroyers in exchange for 8 British leases, 99-year leases on 8 British bases in the Western Hemisphere, most of them in the Caribbean and 1 or 2 in Canada. And so that was the destroyers for bases deal. And it took him 3 months to get up the courage to do that and to mold public opinion beforehand so that they would accept it and so that the Congress wouldn't balk. And he took that risk in spite of the fact that it was an election year and he was running for a 3rd term, which no one had ever done before in this country. And then he finally sold the concept of Lend-Lease to the American people, which was the probably the most generous program in history. Give the British all the weapons they want, all the airplanes, tanks, artillery shells, and merchant ships they need for free. And theoretically, at the end of the war, they were supposed to return them to us, the ones that had not been destroyed or sunk. And he started to propose that policy in mid-December 1940 with a press conference, and then made a major speech, the Arsenal of Democracy speech, December 29th, I think, 1940. That was his biggest fireside chat that he ever gave. And then proposed it to Congress in January 41. And after 2.5 months of spirited debate, bitter debate in Congress, the Lend-Lease bill passed in March 1941 by a very hefty margin. So he did succeed in getting Americans to give all aid short of war to Great Britain, but he never was able to succeed in persuading Americans to fight Nazi Germany or to fight Hitler, and certainly not to fight Japan, which was perceived as a danger in the Pacific, but not nearly as dangerous as Germany. And based on industrial strength, that was the correct way to view those two countries. So Japan was just as ravenous as Germany in terms of wanting to expand its territory, and Japan wanted a huge colonial empire all over Asia. They wanted to kick the white man out of Asia and take over all the other Asian states, and were willing to do it by violence, and we knew that, and we opposed it. But they weren't nearly as dangerous as Nazi Germany because of the industrial plant, which was much less than that of Germany. So while all this is going on, this is the backdrop to what went wrong between the United States and Japan. So I'm getting back now to your question. As soon as Germany invaded France and the Netherlands and was routing their armies and the British Army in May and June of 1940, that was the signal to Japan that, oh boy, they thought this is great. And their philosophy became literally, don't miss the bus. Because by defeating France and by defeating the Netherlands and by kicking the British Army off of the continent of Europe, all of the European colonial empires in Asia suddenly looked very, very weak. And in fact, they were. The Japanese began to realize that, these empires are just a house of cards. And they're ripe for it's like a fruit ripe for the picking off the tree. And so they began to focus on taking the things they wanted in the Far East, and the British and French and Dutch were almost powerless to do anything about it, except for with the forces that they already had out there, which weren't that strong. So what Roosevelt did in May 1940, in this month when Hitler went berserk and overran Western Europe, is he took the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which was normally home-ported on the West Coast in San Diego and San Pedro. And after the annual exercise at sea, he had them go to Pearl Harbor and not back to the West Coast. So in May of 1940, at the end of the annual fleet exercise, he said, go to Pearl Harbor and stay there indefinitely. And he did this as an act of deterrence. It's classic deterrence. It's like a chess player moving a piece on the board, moving his rook out in the middle of the board as a kind of a threat to the other player. So that was supposed to, exactly, in theory, make Japan realize that we were watching them and that we didn't want them to do the same thing in Asia that Germany had just done in Europe. And of course the Japanese noticed that, and of course they didn't like it. But as time went on, and as Roosevelt maintained his primary fixation on trying to do all he could to help Britain defeat Germany, he began to transfer ships from the Pacific Fleet to the Atlantic. And By the time Pearl Harbor was, Roosevelt had transferred about 1/4 of the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor to the Atlantic Ocean, because what we were doing in the Atlantic is we were conducting neutrality patrols. That's what Roosevelt called them. It's a nice little say nothing, mean nothing word that meant when the war started with Poland, Germany invaded Poland. Roosevelt declared that our coastal waters were extended 300 miles out into the Atlantic. And I think at that time, the territorial waters were only 3 miles. So he extended them out to 300 miles. And then as the war went better and better for Hitler and worse for Great Britain, he finally extended our area of interest in the Atlantic to more than halfway across. And he was conducting what he called neutrality patrols in the western half of the Atlantic, right, as far over as Iceland. And the orders to the U.S. Navy ships were, and this is in late 1940 and early 41, was if you notice any German submarines or German surface raiders, you'll radio their position to the British Navy as soon as possible, and you'll tell them where they are. So that wasn't an entirely friendly act. It wasn't quite the same as joining the war, but it was not a friendly act toward Germany. That's how much he was concerned about Hitler's Germany. So he transfers about 1/4 of the ships from Pearl Harbor, and as he does this, the Japanese probably noted that, the U.S. fleet is there, but it's not strong enough to really conduct any major offensives. And in fact, that was true. So the U.S. fleet commander at the time, Admiral Richardson, strongly opposed leaving the fleet in Pearl. He met with Roosevelt twice, once in October of, once in July 1940 and then again in October, and protested vehemently having the fleet in Pearl Harbor, where he felt it was exposed and in danger. And that he told the president, it's not fooling the Japanese. They know we're not strong enough to launch an offensive, and you're just leaving the fleet in an exposed position. There's not enough repair facilities. There's not enough training facilities. And ultimately, he got fired for that. So Roosevelt's policy once he moved the fleet to Pearl in May 1940, it evolved rather rapidly from one of deterrence to one of provocation. And I'm going to just list a couple of milestones in that, the sexy bullet points that would grab anybody's attention. When Admiral Richardson met with Roosevelt in October of 1940, on October 8th, his visit was preceded by a very seminal, very important memo a policy memo written one day before he arrived. By a Commander McCollum. Now, you'd say, oh, he's only a Navy commander. That's not a very important person. well, this guy was an important person. Commander Arthur McCollum was the head of the Far East desk in the Office of Naval Intelligence. And he's one of the 15 or 20 naval officers who would meet fairly regularly, on occasion, with the president to give the president advice. The FDR was a Navy president. He often met with naval officers late in the afternoon when his official business was over, his domestic political business was over, and would talk strategy and international affairs. And so McCollum writes this memo to the head of O&I, and based on what happened after that, we can be sure that FDR saw the memo, because he followed the advice in the memo. So here's some key phrases in this memo from Arthur McCollum to the head of O&I. It's a memo basically about what do we do about Japan given the war in Europe. That was the subject of the memo. So paragraph 9 says, quote, "It is not believed that in the present state of political opinion, the United States government is capable of declaring war against Japan without more ado," unquote. That's a provocative statement. It implies that people would want to make war against Japan, but that they'd have to work a little harder at it. They'd have to make some more ado. So then he provides a shopping list in this memo. This is a policy recommendation memo at a high level in the U.S. government. And there were 8 or 9 policy elements, but the final 3, the most important ones, are the ones that Roosevelt followed in the coming year. One was to keep the main strength of the U.S. fleet in the vicinity of the Hawaiian Islands. Another one was insist that the Dutch refuse to grant Japanese demands for undue economic concessions, particularly oil.
Yes,
and this is important because the nation we now call Indonesia was then called the Dutch East Indies, Netherlands East Indies, and that's where an enormous percentage of the world's oil was, and the Japanese wanted it. At the time, the Japanese were getting 90% of their oil from us, but they were always worried that we might cut off the supply, and in case we did that, they would need to take the Dutch East Indies. So that was one of the points McCollum made, was that insist that the Dutch refuse to grant Japanese demands for undue economic concessions, particularly oil. And the final point in his memo was to completely embargo all U.S. trade with Japan in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British Empire. Cut off all trade with Japan. And by the way, that would mean cut off all U.S. oil also. So, and that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what Roosevelt did at the end of July, which we'll talk about a little bit later. He did cut off all trade with Japan, which cut off the oil spigot, which caused the Japanese to absolutely freak out and accelerate their plans for war. So this is what's in the memo. And at the end of the memo, McCollum says, quote, if by these means, the means we've just discussed, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better, end quote. Now that's really an interesting statement.
Exactly.
Because Roosevelt followed these major actions, the last three that I just discussed, he followed all of them. There were other actions that weren't quite as important, which he followed in part, but he followed all of the major actions. And he met the very next day after this memo was written, Roosevelt did, with Admiral Richardson, who was the Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Fleet. And so Richardson once again complained about the fleet being in Pearl when it should be in San Diego. And Roosevelt said, quote, despite what you believe, I know the presence of the fleet in the Hawaiian area has had and is now having a restraining influence on the actions of Japan, end quote. That's Roosevelt. Richardson responded, quote, Mr. President, I still do not believe it, and I know that our fleet is disadvantageously disposed for preparing for or initiating war, end quote. And for that statement, Richardson, that and another statement, he got fired a couple of months later. Now, these statements from these conversations with the president were published by Richardson in his memoirs, which he did not allow to be published until at the time of his death in the, I think it was the mid-'60s. He wrote his memoirs in the 50s, and then they were published in the mid-'60s. It's called the Treadmill to Pearl Harbor. It's a pretty interesting read. Now, during this meeting with Roosevelt on October 8th, Richardson writes, later, I asked the president if we were going to enter the war, end quote. Roosevelt's answer is quoted as follows. He replied that if the Japanese attacked Thailand or the Kra Peninsula or the Dutch East Indies, we would not enter the war. That if they even attacked the Philippines, he doubted whether we would enter the war. But that they could not always avoid making mistakes. And as the war continued and the area of operations expanded, sooner or later they would make a mistake and we would enter the war, end quote. That's Roosevelt back to Richardson. And the main thing I want your audience to get out of this is that even though the Philippines is a U.S. Commonwealth at the time, we were going to give them independence in 46, but they were still a U.S. possession. Roosevelt didn't think we would enter the war, even if the Japanese attacked the Philippines. But he says sooner or later, using the language of the time, the Japs will make a mistake and we will enter the war. And Roosevelt was confident about that. And Richardson's closing remarks, he said, were, Mr. President, I feel I must tell you that the senior officers of the Navy do not have the trust and confidence in the civilian leadership of this country that is essential for the successful prosecution of a war in the Pacific. So for that bold temerity, Richardson was fired a couple of months later and was replaced by Admiral Husband D. Kimmel, who was the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and who was unjustly, that's another whole story, but unjustly blamed with dereliction of duty and was made, he and the Army Commanding General in Hawaii, General Short and Kimmel were made the scapegoats for the Pearl Harbor debacle, and they were both charged with dereliction of duty by the Roberts Commission, the first It was the Warren Commission of its time, if you want to call it that. So you can see from the McCollum memo of October 7th and the meeting Roosevelt had the next day with Richardson that he's edging from a policy of deterrence to one of provocation. And in case you're not convinced yet, this should convince anybody. Roosevelt met with his Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark. Harold's nickname was Betty. So Roosevelt used to call him on the phone and say, "Betty, I want you to do this and this and this." You got that? Yes, Mr. President. Yes, Mr. President. Betty Stark looked like your grandmother. He looked like somebody's old grandmother, bespectacled, very mild-mannered, and very passive, and more than willing to let Roosevelt run the Navy.
Absolutely.
So Roosevelt meets with, during this period where his policy of deterrence against Japan is evolving into one of provocation, Roosevelt meets with Betty Stark in February 41. And he says, "I want pop-up cruises in or near Japanese territorial waters, either near the home waters of Japan or near some of their possessions in the Pacific." And the intent was to, quite frankly, irritate the hell out of the Japanese and force them to, quote, "make a mistake," end quote. And in fact, the exact quote that I found in Stark's biography, which he put in Stark was a vociferous letter writer, and he put all kinds of things in letters to friends, and they provided a great record later for historians. So here's what Roosevelt told Betty Stark in February 1941, quote, "I just want them to keep popping up here and there and keep the Japs guessing. I don't mind losing 1 or 2 cruisers, but do not take a chance on losing 5 or 6, end quote. That is a key quote to understanding the mind of Franklin D. Roosevelt as he's preoccupied with how to stop Hitler in Europe. That's on his front burner. And on his back burner is, what are we going to do about Japan? But you can see that he's beginning to think, you know what? I think by this time, by February 41, he's beginning to think, you know, if we get into a war against Japan, it's not going to be the end of the world, and it might be our back door into the war against Hitler. And the reason somebody would think that way is because of the infamous Tripartite Pact, which is the defensive treaty, signed in September 1940 by Japan, Germany, and Italy, which basically said, in slightly veiled language, it wasn't too veiled, it said, if a third party, which obviously meant the United States, if a third party attacks any of us, the other two will attack that country. So it was an attempt to keep the U.S. from entering World War II by warning us off. And the treaty also said, you know, that Japan recognized Germany's new empire in Europe, and that Germany would recognize Japan's new order in East Asia, and that they would basically cut the world in half and do whatever the hell they wanted. And they got Mussolini to sign on, oh, by the way, you sign it too. So because of that de facto alliance, it was an alliance, it was a defensive alliance, I think that's when Roosevelt started thinking, you know what, if we just happen to get into conflict with Japan, although they're not the number one worry that I have on my plate, that could be a backdoor into the war with Hitler, which the American people don't want to fight. Something I haven't told your audience yet, which I should say now, is that the polling, the polling had become a science, political polling in America. And so Roosevelt was very attuned to the Gallup poll and other polls being taken. And consistently throughout 1940 and 41, the American people did not want to fight Hitler. And they didn't even think about fighting Japan because they didn't think the Japanese would have the brass to attack us. They had very prejudiced views of Japanese as little bow-legged men who couldn't build good airplanes, who couldn't make good pilots, who couldn't see well enough to make good pilots, and who couldn't build good ships. So they weren't even worried about Japan, the American people. And they just didn't want to fight Germany. So even at the time we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, 75 to 80% of the American people, consistently, week after week, did not want to fight Nazi Germany. And this is after a year and a half of speeches by Roosevelt and Churchill to try to educate the public. this tripartite pact, this defensive alliance between the three Axis nations, and the bad polling numbers is what probably made Roosevelt start to think about, well, I don't want to do that, but I might have to use a backdoor to war. And I'll just end with one thing here, and that's a very important statistic. Now, these statistics, they're not even in my book. I just learned about them recently from a website, and these are the actual percentages of war material produced during World War II by different countries. Listen to this. The United States, even though we got into the war late, we produced 41.7% of all war material in World War II. This one country, the United States, 41%. Germany produced 14.4%. USSR, 14%. Great Britain, 10.2%. Japan, 3.5%. That's the story here, is that the 7 strongest powers on the planet produce 90% of the war material. And these are the after-the-fact figures, but I mean, we had a pretty good sense in this country of what our industrial potential was if we were to convert automobile factories into making tanks and airplanes, which is what we did. And so this is why I think we knew that Japan, compared to our industrial potential, was not a serious threat. And even if we had a war with Japan, we knew that even if there were initial setbacks, which most people didn't think there would be, but even if there were initial setbacks, Japan would never threaten our existence as a country. It was just not going to happen. Germany was a concern because at the time they were the world's preeminent military power, certainly in terms of land armies and air force. So, but these statistics, which are always in the minds of American planners, I think are what allowed them to think such thoughts of, well, sooner or later the Japanese will make a mistake and then we'll enter the war, and you know what, maybe it's okay, which is the mindset of Commander McCollum. So this is all a background to the basic foundation for the main story in my book, which is how did Japan and America come to blows? And I think there's something that a lot of people may not know, and that is that even though there were many frictions, and well, let me back up here. We had broken the Japanese diplomatic code in September 1940, and we ended up giving it the name, the decrypted messages, we gave them the name magic. So whenever you pick up a history book and read about the magic intercepts or the magic decrypted messages, that's the U.S. ability, using an amazing machine that the Army and Navy built together, Army and Navy codebreakers, the Purple Machine. We called it the Purple Machine because we were breaking what we called the Japanese Purple Code, which was their new diplomatic code, which they introduced shortly before World War II. The magic intercepts allowed us to know what they were thinking, what the Tokyo Foreign Ministry was telling its embassies all over the world. Now, they weren't telling their embassies military secrets or military plans, but they were telling their people about the debate going on in Tokyo, whether they were going to go north and attack their traditional enemy, Russia, or whether they were going to go south and grab all the resources, the rubber, the tin, the rice, and the oil of Southeast Asia. And we knew this debate was going on within the Japanese government. We knew it for quite some time. And so this is the backdrop to these tensions between Japan and America. And what Roosevelt did in late July 1941, well, let me back up one more time. In 1940, Japan began its southern move by pressuring Vichy France, the puppet government of a defeated France. The southern half of France wasn't occupied by Germany. It was called Vichy France, but they didn't have much power. And so Japanese pressured them into allowing air bases to be built in North Vietnam, what we now call northern Vietnam, air bases, and to use ports in North Vietnam, seaports like Hanoi. And then a year later, in the summer of 41, and we knew they were about to do this, the Japanese pressured Vichy France into letting the Japanese occupy the southern half of what we now call well, then it was called French Indochina, but we now call it South Vietnam and Cambodia. So they were about to occupy those places, and we knew that the only reason to do that was if Japan was going to make a big move toward the south, a move of conquest, and take Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore and the Dutch East Indies. So, of course, we didn't like that at all. So Roosevelt imposed a freeze on all, U.S.-Japanese trade on July 26, 1941. I think it was the day after they occupied southern French Indochina. And he did this for two reasons. He did it to show our displeasure with what they were up to. He did it for another reason. And the other reason was because Hitler had stabbed Stalin in the back, and even though they had a non-aggression treaty, and even though they had split Poland in two, he suddenly invaded the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941. And that was his first major mistake of the war, of course. We all now know that. But to him, it was a war of extermination. He was determined to destroy the Slav race and turn Russia into his breadbasket and his industrial base. So, and take over their oil too in the Caucasus. So, once he did that, the Japanese were really in a dither, and they had this internal argument going on. They didn't know whether to move north against their traditional enemy, Russia, or to go south. And Professor Waldo Heinrichs wrote a great book called Threshold of War, 1988, and I subscribe to his thesis that Roosevelt's main goal, once Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, his main goal was no longer to save Britain, it was to keep Russia in the war. That was even more important than not allowing Britain to go down to defeat. Because the killing field in the Soviet Union between Germans and Russians was just beyond conception. There were so many soldiers on both sides being killed that Roosevelt did not want Hitler to get a knockout blow. So, yes, he was displeased with the Japanese move into southern French Indochina, but I agree with Professor Heinrichs that the main reason he imposed the freeze on Japanese assets, which meant we cut off their oil supplies in July 41, was to force the Japanese to move south instead of north, and to prevent the Japanese from invading Siberia. Because if they had done so, it probably would have knocked the Russians out of the war. The Germans got as far as the suburbs of Moscow in 1941, and the only reason that capital city did not fall was because the Russians, in October 41, transferred 1.5 million troops from Siberia, where they had been there in case the Japanese were going to attack. They said transferred them from Siberia to the Moscow front, and that's the only reason Moscow didn't fall, and that allowed the Russians to launch a counterattack against Hitler in early 42. So Roosevelt probably played a major role in preventing the fall of the Soviet Union, because by cutting off Japan's oil, they went into an absolute panic. And as we didn't know it at the time, but as early as just 2 weeks later, by August 9th, the Japanese had decided that we're going to have to go south instead of north, and we're going to have to do it because we need the oil in the Dutch East Indies. And if we're going to take the Dutch East Indies, we're going to have to protect our lines of communication and supply. So that means we'll also have to go to war with Great Britain and the United States, because the United States had the Philippines astride their supply routes to Japan. And, of course, the British had Malaya and Singapore over to the west, and we had the Philippines to the east of their supply routes. So they decided in August to go to war with the Netherlands, Great Britain, and the United States. And we didn't know it yet, but that's when they made that decision. It was right after the oil embargo. So what happened between the oil embargo and late November 41 was that the United States and Japan were very much aware that they were headed for a major conflict, and that war was only a matter of time. What both countries were working toward was what they both called a modus vivendi, which is Latin. It's a diplomatic language meaning a way of living together. So they both wanted to achieve a modus vivendi, which would allow them to delay war for 3 to 6 months. And the Japanese made their big proposal for a way to delay war on November 20th, and the United States massaged it a little bit, made a few changes, and we were ready to make our counteroffer on November 25th The cabinet had approved it, although they didn't have to. The president makes foreign policy, him and the Secretary of State, but the cabinet had also approved it. It had been approved by Churchill. We were about to present that when something happened that caused Roosevelt to flip overnight and change the U.S. foreign policy of Japan overnight from one of seeking temporary accommodation and delaying war by at least 3 months to giving them an ultimatum that there's no way they could have accepted it. That the ultimatum that he had delivered to the Japanese on November 26th was stunning. It demanded that Japan withdraw all its troops and naval forces from China. Japan had been in a major war with China for 4 years, since 1937. It was, in a way, it was their Vietnam. Japan couldn't win in China, and they couldn't withdraw because of the loss of face. They'd had so many soldiers killed in China that they couldn't withdraw. They thought they needed the Chinese resources and territory for their glorious empire, and they couldn't accept or publicly admit that they couldn't win. So they were really had a problem there. So we demanded that in our ultimatum of the 26th of November, which is called the Hull Note, Secretary of State Hull had his name affixed to the note, withdraw from China, that they abandon the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, that they only recognize Chiang Kai-shek as the leader of China. That was the nationalist leader of China that they were fighting, so that was unacceptable.
Right.
And that in exchange for those things, that we would resume some sales of oil to them, although not for their military, some sales of oil. And that they also agree to respect the territorial integrity of French Indochina and the Netherlands East Indies. So these things were unacceptable, and he knew that. Right. And so the question is, why did he do this? Why would Roosevelt flip overnight and move and reverse himself from seeking temporary accommodation with Japan to giving them an ultimatum they couldn't accept? And that's probably the most exciting part of my book, is I think I've come up with the answer. None of the mainstream historians have ever answered this question satisfactorily.
No, they have not.
And I believe, to make a long story short, that there's a key Japanese Navy message from Admiral Yamamoto. Now, Admiral Yamamoto was the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, of the Japanese fleet. He had above him a naval general staff. The naval general staff was supposed to decide what to do and who to attack, and the commander-in-chief of the fleet was supposed to decide how to do it and execute the plans of the general staff. But Yamamoto was such a forceful personality that he had decided months before, in fact, he had decided the previous January of 1941, he had decided that if war was inevitable between Japan and America, that the American Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor had to be destroyed on the first day of the war, so that Japan could then move freely into the Southeast Asia area and Dutch East Indies area and take what they wanted without interference. So he had first proposed that plan back in January, and then when Roosevelt cut off the oil at the end of July, the Japanese military went into a panic, and the general staff finally did the unthinkable, and they accepted his plan, the fleet commander's plan, to attack the United States, which they did not want to do. They were willing to just take the Dutch East Indies and take Singapore and Malaya from England and do nothing and wait for the United States to attack them. And he forced them to accept his plan by threatening to resign, that he and his entire staff of the combined fleet would resign in October if they didn't get their way, and if they didn't get to use all 6 of the big Japanese aircraft carriers in the operation. So they gave him his way. He got his way because of the force of his personality. And then he sent a message out that was totally unnecessary on November 22nd, 1941. That's interesting, that date. It's just coincidental, but that's a big date for anybody that studies the Kennedy assassination.
Absolutely.
But on November 22nd, Yamamoto sends out a message in what we call the JN-25 code. Now, the JN-25 code is not the magic, it's not the diplomatic messages I mentioned earlier, which were sent over the Japanese purple machine, which we broke with our purple machine, and we called the diplomatic messages magic. Japanese Navy was using a new code they introduced in 1939 called which we call JN-25, Japanese Navy 25. It was a very complicated code, hard to break, involved a lot of time and a lot of manual work, whereas the purple machine was an electronic machine that would break Japanese messages electronically. The JN-25 code had to be broken manually, and it was a lot of trouble. But we were making some progress in it, reasonably good progress. The British had made tremendous progress in breaking JN-25. They were well more than a year ahead of us and had more resources devoted to doing so. And so on November 22nd, Yamamoto sends this message to his carrier fleet that's going to attack Pearl Harbor. The reason this was unnecessary is they already knew what the plan was, and they had already written, the carrier fleet had already written its own op order to do this. But the Japanese love of formality is such that he still had to say it and give a formal order so that his underling, Admiral Nagumo, in charge of the carriers, could then issue his operation order. So the message read, "The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet in Hawaii and deal it a mortal blow." And the end of the message is the thing that makes it a virtual certainty that this is what Roosevelt was reacting to when he sent his ultimatum. Because the end of the message says, "Should the negotiations with the United States prove successful, the task force shall hold itself in readiness forthwith to return and reassemble." I'm going to tell your audience what that means. That means if the negotiations are successful with the United States to avoid war, the fleet will turn around and come home and will not attack Hawaii. That's what that meant. It's in very formal, stilted language, but that's what it means.
Right.
This message was sent on November 22nd. There was a second damning message sent on November 25th by Yamamoto, which was a sailing order, which basically said, it listed the location they were going to sail from. It said the task force will leave Hitokapu Bay on the morning of 26 November and advance to 42 degrees north, 170 degrees east, and refuel on the afternoon of 3rd December. And that's all that said. But it gave an underway date of the 26th, and it said where they were, which was a very, very remote, windswept, bare location in the Kurile Islands, north of the Japanese main islands. And the location of the refueling was a location in the middle of the North Pacific, more than halfway to Hawaii, which would have made the destination eminently clear, because it gave a refueling point. So, and that message was sent the 25th of November. So one or both of these messages were surely decrypted and came into Roosevelt's hands either very late on November 25th or early the morning of the 26th, because it was the morning of the 26th of November that he called Secretary of State Hull to the White House and ordered him to flip the foreign policy and send out this other thing instead. The other thing had been on his desk for 8 days. It had been passed to him by Treasury Secretary Morgenthau, the ultimatum, but he had decided not to use it. What made him decide to use it overnight? And Secretary of State Hull went back, after a 15-minute meeting in the White House, he went back to his office and was in a rage. And he says, "Those men in the White House do not understand what they're doing. You cannot give an ultimatum to a proud people. They will go to war against us," unquote. And that was recorded by one of his assistants, a gift to history. So Hull issued the Hull note, but he didn't write it. It came from the Treasury Department, and it was a reversal of what they were about to give, which was our own modus vivendi, our own way to postpone war for at least 3 months. So the British anecdotal accounts from surviving codebreakers, numerous surviving accounts, say that before these people died in the 1980s, say that they gave Prime Minister Churchill ample warning that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. And these were people that were working in their codebreaker unit in Singapore, called the Far East Combined Bureau. And these are the people that were more than a year ahead of us in breaking the JN-25 code, and they had a lot more people devoted to it than we did. Most of our people were working on the magic diplomatic intercepts every day and not on the JN-25. So although the U.S. Navy although the person in charge of the Navy code breaking, Captain Lawrence Safford, although he said after the war, in two different letters, a couple of decades after the war ended, he said, we had broken JN-25 to a readable extent by December 7th. In two different letters to two different people in the 1970s, he said that. He said, but we were reading traffic that was about a month old. It was coming to the West Coast by Pan Am Clipper, or sometimes even by a ship. The intercepted messages, which were just looked like hieroglyphics, they were just a bunch of numbers. They were coming to the West Coast by airplane or ship, and then going across the U.S. by airmail or train. And they were piling up in Washington, D.C., and getting broken about a month late. So I have concluded that it's a virtual certainty that the British codebreakers broke one or both of these messages, probably the first one from November 22nd, which listed Hawaii twice in the message, mentioned destroying the U.S. fleet in Hawaii, and then said if negotiations are successful, turn around and come home. So that's my contribution to this debate, is that I think that I've identified it's been hiding in plain sight since 1946, this message. It was published in two U.S. reports. One was a congressional investigation report on Pearl Harbor, and the other one was a book called Campaigns of the Pacific War, which was written by the Army after they interrogated all the naval officers right after the war was over. And so they both published these messages in 46. The thing that's confusing, ST, is that the U.S. Navy wrote a secret report in 1946 admitting that we had intercepted something like 26,000 Japanese Navy messages over a 3-month period. Just between September 1941 and December 7th, we had intercepted. This is U.S. radio men with earphones on, sitting at Japanese typewriters, copying down the Japanese Morse code for their operational messages. And we had all these intercepts, over 26,000, of using various codes. One of them, most commonly used, JN-25. So the U.S. Navy wrote a report for itself in 1946 saying, we intercepted 26,000 messages in the 3 months before Pearl Harbor. They claimed in the report that we didn't decode any of the Pearl Harbor-related messages until after the war was over, until late 1945 and early 46. And they said that of the 26,000, 188 of those messages were directly related to the Pearl Harbor attack in one way or another. And if we had all 188, decrypted before the attack, people could have put the story together. It's conveniently, however,
right.
The two messages I just read to your audience, they're not among the 188 messages. So the U.S. government, even in 1946, doesn't admit to ever intercepting those. But you know what? I don't believe it.
Right.
We intercepted so many messages over a 3-month period that I don't believe it. I think we know there was a massive cover-up within the Navy communications section right after Pearl Harbor. All the people working there at the time talked about it after the war. So I think the British probably forwarded that message to us from Churchill to Roosevelt, and I think after the attack occurred, I think the Navy probably started decrypting these month-old messages they had and said, oh my God. And I think the simplest thing to do is to destroy the 1 or 2 or 3 smoking guns and just pretend like we never intercepted those, and then lock the other ones away and claim later that, well, we didn't have time. We didn't even decrypt these till 1945. I don't believe it. I was in the Navy for 10 years. I was a naval officer for 10 years and then worked for the Navy 10 more years as a civil servant. And the Navy's so big on lessons learned that whenever anything goes wrong, they conduct in-depth, major investigations. They always want to know what went wrong, why did it go wrong, and how can we correct it. So I just don't believe what this 1946 secret report said. That secret report was prepared in case Congress was to ask about JN-25 codebreaking. And Congress never did. They didn't know enough to ask about it. They were focused on the diplomatic codebreaking. So that report remained classified until 1992, when it was finally released by the NSA and given to the National Archives. It's clear that all the Japanese messages being sent at the time were in the JN-25 code, and it's the British who remember warning Churchill British codebreakers who are deceased today, but they told enough people that I believe it. And there's enough people in London who say that they knew. And there's even one official that says, have our American brethren been notified? And he was told at a meeting, yes, absolutely. So I believe that's my contribution to this story, is to identify the one message that's almost certainly the cause for Roosevelt sending Japan this ultimatum in late November 41. And although they had this plan to attack Pearl Harbor, it wasn't finalized, truly finalized by the emperor and the military government until after they got the ultimatum from us, the Hull Note. So there's one big part of the story, ST, that I haven't covered yet, and I think it's the Rosetta Stone to understanding the backdoor to war thesis.
All right.
So if we still have time, I'd like to go into that.
We absolutely have time. I'm St. Patrick, and you're listening to the Midnight Rider News Show. We'll be right back. In episode 001 of the Midnight Rider News Show, Juliet Toth discussed Lee Harvey Oswald's controversial time spent in New Orleans, and author-researcher Gary Fannin discussed the innocence of Oswald and went so far as to name the Grassy Knoll shooter. Download episode 001 of the Midnight Rider News Show today.
Hi, this is Gary Fannin, JFK historian and author of The Innocence of Oswald. When you want the truth, don't tune into the mainstream media. Listen to my friend St. Patrick on the Midnight Rider News podcast.
And we are back with Doug Horne, the author of Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War, the featured work on MidnightRiderNews.com. Doug, you're about to make a major point about a pivotal moment, so the floor is again yours.
Okay. It's called the Argentia Conference. Argentia, or maybe it's pronounced Argentia. It's the name of the conference it's the first in-person meeting between President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill, and it predates Pearl Harbor by about 4 months.
Okay.
So what happened was Roosevelt had been persuading the American people that we can't let Britain go down. We can't let Germany defeat Great Britain, because then they would take over the British Navy, and they'd have all those shipyards, and then they could rule the Atlantic. So he had given the Destroyers for Bases deal, which I mentioned earlier. He had persuaded the Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act in March 41. So we were giving Britain everything we could make for free. And of course, they always wanted more. And they also wanted us to enter the war, which Roosevelt knew he couldn't do that, because he knew Congress would debate the war for 3 months, and like they had the Lend-Lease bill, and that after that, even if they did declare war, he would be taking a divided country to war after an acrimonious debate. So he wanted to meet Churchill and take his measure, and vice versa. So they decided to have a meeting in secret in August 41, mid-August. So Roosevelt and a couple of U.S. Navy heavy cruisers and some destroyers sailed up as fast as they could in the fog to meet Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland. And the name of the base nearby was one of the bases we got when we gave him 50 destroyers, Argentia base. And the name of the bay was Placentia Bay. So there's a lot of names here, but they met at Placentia Bay. It's called the Argentia Conference. Churchill came over in the battleship Prince of Wales and 3 or 4 destroyers. And they met, and they had a 4-day conference. And on the surface, the only thing that came out of the conference was a document called the Atlantic Charter. But I've characterized the Atlantic Charter, I'm not going to mince words. It was a propaganda document about moralistic post-war aims. I mean, we weren't even in the war yet. Right. And it talked about what kind of world do we want to have after the defeat of Germany. That was the language in this document. It was a propaganda document about moralistic post-war aims produced to justify the conference in a non-threatening way to FDR's isolationist opponents in the Congress and in the American public. About 1/3 of the American public were strong isolationists, and about 80% of the American people did not want to fight Hitler. A majority didn't mind giving aid to Churchill, but they didn't want to fight Hitler. So this is what was done on the surface to justify the meeting so that Roosevelt wouldn't be lynched when he went home. But what was really important at the conference was that he made 2 secret agreements with Churchill. They were oral agreements, which he did not tell the American people about when he came home. And if he had, he probably would have been impeached. So the first agreement was to commence convoying British ships from Canada to Iceland on September 1st, 1941. So we'd been giving Britain all this free war material, but we had not been escorting the ships with U.S. Navy warships, because the president knew that would lead to war with Germany. That German U-boats that were sinking British cargo ships would end up sinking U.S. warships, and that would mean war. And so he was loath to do that for many, many months. All his advisors said, we have to convoy the British war material, and he kept saying, no, the American people won't want to do that. So he finally agrees in secret to do that, to start doing it in early September. And then, this is the clincher here, he told Churchill, he says, I cannot declare war, but I can wage war. I can make war on Germany. He says, I will wage an undeclared war against the German Navy in the North Atlantic, concurrent with us beginning to convoy your cargo ships, in the hope that there would be an incident that would serve as a casus belli, as a cause for war. So he agrees to convoy their ships all the way to Iceland, because the British Navy was stretched very thin. They didn't have enough warships. We would convoy them 2/3 of the way over, and that in doing so, we would make undeclared war against the German U-boats in the hope that there would be an incident. And the reason we know about this is because Churchill went back and reported it to the cabinet, and the secret cabinet minutes were recorded, and later they were declassified. So we know these things were said, and by the way, these promises of his were recorded by 2 of Churchill's secretaries also in their memoirs. And as far as Japan goes, Churchill wanted Roosevelt to warn Japan that if they attacked Singapore and Malaya, that the U.S. would make war on Japan. And Roosevelt said, no, I'll baby them along for several months. I'll just baby them along, and we'll buy some more time in the Far East. So these were the secret agreements made at the Argentia conference. And the interesting thing is that concurrent with this, at the very same time, we get this magic diplomatic intercept, both the British and us, because we had given them the purple machines. We had given them 2 of our purple machines, so they could decode the Japanese diplomatic messages also. So both leaders get back to their countries, and they're presented with this important message that was decrypted by the purple machine. And the message was from the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, Baron Oshima, back to the foreign ministry in Tokyo. And in that message, the Japanese ambassador is quoting Hitler. And here's the quote. The quote was, this is a quote of Adolf Hitler, in the event of a collision between Japan and the United States, Germany would at once open hostilities with America, end quote. So Churchill was presented with this on August 23rd, after he got back from his conference with Roosevelt, and I'm sure Roosevelt was presented with this shortly after he got back from his trip to Canada on his warships. And Churchill even wrote some marginalia on his copy of the message, which is in the British National Archives today. And his note to the head of MI6 was, he says, I assume the Americans have this because they gave us this machine we were using to decrypt it, but he said, have the Americans seen this? And he got the answer the next day from Sir Stuart Menzies, the head of MI6, who said, yes, the Americans have had this message. So Menzies would have obtained that information, I'm sure, through their secret underwater cable telephone line with New York City. They had a spy office in Rockefeller Center, a British purchasing mission run by the man called Intrepid, William Stevenson, and he would have obtained that confirmation, I'm sure, from Stevenson through this underwater cable they had. So what I'm telling your audience is that not only was Roosevelt seeking combat incidents, which he was willing to engineer by making war on U-boats, undeclared war against German U-boats, not only did he want incidents to get us into the war against Hitler, but when he got home from that conference, he found out that Hitler had promised Japan that if they were in a war with the U.S. for any reason, he would make war on America. So that as soon as Roosevelt got back from the Argentia conference, he was presented with this, what I call hip pocket information, that if I can't get into war with Germany through the front door, which is what I'm trying to do in the North Atlantic by making war against German U-boats, then I have a card I can play. I can get into the war against Hitler by fighting Japan, because Hitler will then declare war on us. And so what happened, it's taken a long time to get here to this part of the story, but what happened was there were three incidents between U.S. Navy ships and German U-boats. One was in September 41. U-boat fired 2 torpedoes at the USS Greer, and they both missed. But Roosevelt made a big deal about it. He made a major speech later in September to try to stir up a war fever, and it didn't work. But what he did is he used that speech to justify the convoying. He justified convoying British ships by the fact that the U-boat had attacked an American destroyer. He said, we're going to do whatever we have to protect the shipping in the Atlantic and to protect the goods we're sending to Great Britain. So that was his justification for the convoying that he'd already decided to do. And then another ship was attacked by a U-boat on, I think it was October 16th, USS Kearney, and one of the torpedoes hit and exploded, and several people on the ship were killed, and the destroyer barely made it back to port in Iceland. And Roosevelt made a big Navy Day speech on October 27th and tried to stir up a war fever, and it didn't work. The American people just didn't give a damn.
Exactly.
And so there was a third ship struck by torpedo on October 31st, USS Reuben James, and the ship sank with tremendous loss of life. All the officers were killed, and a total of 115 of the crew died. And Roosevelt didn't make any more speeches. He didn't even try, because he knew it was a lost cause. The American people were not going to go to war because of incidents between individual U-boats and individual American ships. That's how wary they were of war. So I think with that third incident, that's clearly the point by which Roosevelt had decided, I'm going to have to use the back door. And of course, that's what he ended up doing on November 26th by sending the Horne note to the ultimatum to the Japanese. So we've reached a point now where, for anyone in the audience who might doubt, well, did Roosevelt really know? I'm going to try to remove all doubt from your mind. The Dutch naval attaché in Washington, D.C. was Captain Johan Raneft. And he was a person who was much beloved by the U.S. Navy because he had stolen the plans to the world's best anti-aircraft gun for naval ships and given them to the United States. It was a joint Swedish-Dutch enterprise. So the Bofors gun, the 40-millimeter Bofors gun, the pom-pom guns that you see on all the U.S. Navy ships and all the war newsreels, he gave us the plans, and our guns weren't worth a damn. And so we were very grateful to this man. And so he had carte blanche with the U.S. Navy and with the Office of Naval Intelligence. Now, in and of himself, he's not a very important person because his country's already been overrun by the Nazis. I mean, Nazis invaded Holland in May 1940, and Belgium and France. But his government in exile is in London, and he's still the Dutch naval attaché of the United States. It's just the government in exile. And so he's communicating with the Dutch colony in Indonesia, Dutch East Indies, and he's communicating with his bosses in London. So anyway, he's visiting ONI regularly, Office of Naval Intelligence, and he makes 2 key diary entries. And by the way, he published his diary of his 7 years in the United States in, I believe it was 1952. 1952, he published his diary in Dutch. So here's his diary entry for December 2nd, 1941. This is 5 days before the Pearl Harbor attack. He says, December 2nd, 1941, Meeting at Navy Department. The location of 2 Japanese carriers leaving Japan with eastern course are pointed out to me on the map. That's the quote. That's really interesting. It means that the people at Office of Naval Intelligence are tracking Japanese aircraft carriers traveling across the North Pacific in an easterly direction. Most of the Japanese fleet was going south, but that's not what this diary entry is talking about. It's talking about 2 carriers going east. Now, the numbers were wrong. Somebody at ONI obviously didn't know that there were 6 aircraft carriers heading east. But nobody in the world had ever done that before. Nobody had ever put 6 aircraft carriers together in one task force, ever. U.S. Navy usually operated 1 carrier alone as a scouting force for battleships. The most carriers we'd ever put together in an exercise was 2 at one time. So this may have affected our analysis of what we were listening to. By the way, the Japanese did not maintain radio silence. Japanese carriers were communicating with their supply train, with their fleet, their 7 fleet oilers that were refueling them. They refueled 3 times on the way to Hawaii. They encountered major storms, and the oilers got lost and separated from the warships. And so we have the Japanese flagship, the Akagi. This is reconstructed by Robert Stinnett later, who wrote the great book Day of Deceit in the year 2000. So we had U.S. radiomen on the West Coast and in Alaska for about a 5 or 6 day period, intercepting radio transmissions from the Japanese flagship, the Akagi, carrier Akagi, to the fleet oilers, which they were transmitting at a very low frequency at low power, which they probably thought nobody could hear more than 300 or 400 miles away. But as it turns out, there was a lot of sunspot activity, and you could hear those signals halfway around the world, anybody's radio signal at this time. So this is how ONI would have obtained that information, was from radio direction finding. It's called RDF. I don't have any more time than that tonight to talk about it, but just to mention it, that if you want to read about what happened and how ONI would have determined this, you can read Robert Stinnett's book, Day of Deceit. It's a very good book about, right, and I know you're familiar with it.
Yes, it's a fantastic.
So the second diary entry, the really damning one, is from December the 6th. It's the day before the Pearl Harbor attack. Here's the diary entry. Saturday, December 6, 1941. At 1400 to the Navy Department, that's 2 p.m. The department is closed except the division of ONI, where a night watch is kept. Everyone present at ONI. Confer with Director Admiral Wilkinson, Captain McCollum. So Commander McCollum's been promoted by now. He's now a captain. Captain McCollum, Lieutenant Commander Kramer. At my request, they show me the location of the 2 carriers, and then he says, see my entry of December 2nd. They show me the location of the 2 carriers west of Honolulu. I ask, what is the meaning of these carriers at this location? Whereupon I receive the answer that it is probably in connection with Japanese reports of eventual American action. In other words, it's just double talk. Here's the clincher. No one among us mentions the possibility of an attack on Honolulu. I myself do not think about it because I believe everyone at Honolulu is 100% on the alert, just like everyone here at the Office of Naval Intelligence, end quote. So they show him on a chart the location of what they think are 2 carriers heading east from Japan on December 2nd. Then on December the 6th, he asks about it, and they show him again. And they're so close to Hawaii by this time. It was almost directly north by this time, that he's worried about Honolulu. Honolulu, for those who don't know, is the capital city on the island of Oahu, and it's right next door to Pearl Harbor. So he's using the word Honolulu. Pearl Harbor is the naval base right next door. So these, in my opinion, these diary entries are unchallengeable. The translations from Dutch to English have been verified by The Hague and the Netherlands, and I don't think they can be challenged. A lot of mainstream historians choose to ignore them. 1 or 2 have challenged them without justification. And so their challenges are not worthy of consideration because they've said that the translations are suspect, but they haven't provided alternative translations, and they haven't told us what was wrong. So therefore, it's just an example of people that don't want to believe something deciding not to believe it. But I believe the diary entries. So what's going on in the final days before Pearl Harbor? The U.S. military is sending out a host of warnings to everyone in the Far East that Japan is about to make hostile moves in any and all directions. But the focus in these messages is primarily on Southeast Asia. And no one ever mentions Hawaii in the warning messages. So, although one of the messages from the Navy, I think it was on the 24th of November, says Japanese could make hostile, aggressive move in any direction at any time, there are other messages that specifically mention the Kra Peninsula, which is Malaya and Thailand, and they're pointing toward the south, Japanese fleet going south. No one ever mentioned Hawaii. And, of course, for that reason, the commanders in Hawaii really weren't that concerned. I mean, they were Admiral Kimmel was concerned about Japanese submarines, but no one conceived of a nation like Japan having the expertise to launch a massive carrier raid with 6 aircraft carriers, that they would have the guts to do it, that they would have the expertise to do it. And so we were just strategically terribly unprepared for war, we weren't preparing for what the enemy could do physically. We were preparing for what we thought the enemy would do, which was attack Southeast Asia. So why? Let me summarize. There's key language in the war warnings that harken back to the Commander McCollum memo of October 1940. And the key language is, if hostilities are unavoidable, the United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. This was in Army and Navy messages in late November. The United States desires that Japan commit the first overt act. There was supplementary language that said, do not take any provocative action that could be construed as offensive in nature. And so, it was very straightforward. Don't do anything that could cause the Japanese to blame a war on us. And so this mindset of wanting the enemy to be clearly the aggressor and clearly in the wrong so that the American people would have no doubt as to who started the war, this is why someone like President Roosevelt, in my opinion, it's clear that it's why he didn't warn the Hawaiian commanders. He wasn't afraid of Japan's industrial base. He knew how weak it was. He didn't know that how good their airplanes were or how good their pilots were. Nobody did at that time. But he knew they couldn't build ships very fast, and he knew they didn't have any oil, and he knew they couldn't make a lot of steel, and he knew they couldn't make airplanes very fast. So and he knew he had a backdoor to war in his hip pocket, that Hitler had promised to make war on the U.S. even if Japan started a war. Hitler didn't care who started it. He said, because the Tripartite Pact was only a defensive alliance. So this Hitler promise is much bigger than the Tripartite Pact. The Tripartite Pact simply meant that if the U.S. attacked Japan, that Hitler would go to Japan's aid. Hitler's promise of August meant that even if Japan started a war, Hitler would still make war on America. So once Roosevelt knew, this is the way I see it, once Roosevelt knew that his 3 naval incidents in the Atlantic with the German Navy had not accomplished what he wanted, which was to create a war fever and a congressional declaration of war against Germany, he really had no choice but to either hope that Hitler would declare war on us, which he certainly was not intent on doing at the time. He was embroiled with Stalin and fighting Stalin in Russia, or he could hope for an incident with Japan. And the Japanese dropped a plum in the president's lap as soon as Roosevelt got word of this decrypted message, which I believe he got that word early on the morning of the 26th of November. And the timing fits. That message was sent November 22nd. It would have taken about a day or a day and a half for the British and the Far East to not only intercept the message, but decrypt the message. Japanese Navy JN 25 code was very labor intensive, and it would take several hours or maybe a day to decode a message. And at the time, the British were decoding many, many, many JN 25 messages. That's what their records make clear. I document that in the book. So then they would have needed some time to transmit the information to Churchill once they verified that it was correct. And they would have had to encode it in their own system and send it to Churchill via radio. And then he would have needed time to process the information and decide what to do about it. And then pass a message to Roosevelt. So this is why I think that message is the one. Not only did it say, if negotiations succeed, turn around and come home, the timing is also right. So, yeah, the sailing order from the 25th is also a candidate for what might have alerted Roosevelt, but there was barely enough time to intercept that, decode it, and get the message to Churchill and for him to get it to Roosevelt. It would have all had to have happened like clockwork, boom, 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 without any delay. So it's much more likely it was the message of the 22nd. And so some interesting things are in the record, which really they present a strong circumstantial. We're going to wind this up now in about 10 minutes, I think. A strong circumstantial case that Roosevelt did get this message on the 26th. There was a Navy Court of Inquiry in 1944, one of the many Pearl Harbor investigations. And Admiral Kimmel was allowed to ask questions of Admiral Stark, who had been his boss in 1940. Admiral Stark was the Chief of Naval Operations in 41, subsequently fired after Pearl Harbor. And Kimmel says to him, "Do you recall whether on or about 26 November you received information from the Office of Naval Intelligence that it had specific evidence of Japan's intention to wage an offensive war against Great Britain and the United States?" So Kimmel had obviously become privy to some vital information. He had people running to him after Pearl Harbor, feeding him pieces of information. Did you know this? Did you know that? So one of these people obviously told him what had happened. Here's what happened. Admiral Stark refused to answer the question. This is in a courtroom setting, the Naval Court of Inquiry. And the Naval Court of Inquiry transcript continues, quote, "The witness," that means Admiral Stark, "stated that to answer the question would involve the disclosure of information detrimental to the public interest, and that he claimed his privilege against revealing state secrets. The court announced that the witness's claim of privilege to the question was honored, and that he need not answer the question," end quote. So Admiral Kimmel knew that the U.S. government had received some crucial information about Japan's intention to make war on us on the 26th of November. And Stark refused to answer the question. Now, General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, was pressed by the Army Pearl Harbor Board, another investigation about Pearl Harbor in 1944. He was pressed about, why did you release your war warning on November 27th? That you were out of town at Army maneuvers. Why did someone release your war warning about a war with Japan on November 27th? And he says, quote, "I think the message was based on something that came in on the 26th, I'd rather imagine, but I have no clear recollection," unquote. That's really interesting. Yes. When you marry up that data point with the previous question that Kimmel posed to Stark. So significantly, as I say in my book, Marshall did not say that it was the whole note of November 26th, our ultimatum to Japan, that was the stimulus for the war warning the next day. Rather, he says it was something that came in on the 26th. So I think this is all, beginning to fit together. Now, later, before the Joint Congressional Committee, was asking General Marshall, were we receiving from the British secret intelligence that was not the magic diplomatic messages? He said yes. He admitted to receiving intelligence that was not the magic decrypted messages that was passed to the U.S. from Great Britain in paraphrased form. And he stated, "We did not receive verbatim decrypts early in the war, but rather evaluations or summaries. And he said, I am quite certain that would not be in your record, sir, because we've been trying to keep that quiet as much as we could, unquote. So, we do have an historical mystery here. What caused Roosevelt to flip his foreign policy on its head on November 26th and send the Japanese an ultimatum? And I've explained what I think it was. And I've explained that, by the way, in addition to the U.S. war warnings sent on November 24th and 27th to the commanders saying we want Japan to commit the first overt act of war, not us. Just prior to that, in a cabinet meeting, following a cabinet meeting, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, the General Marshal's boss, wrote down in his diary a presidential quote. So the president said on November 25th, now this is the day before we sent that ultimatum, the day before I think Roosevelt was notified about the Pearl Harbor attack. Roosevelt told the cabinet, quote, the question was how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves, end quote. So he wrote that in his diary, and it became a subject of great discussion in the congressional investigation after the war, Pearl Harbor investigation. And so they didn't like his oral responses. Secretary Stimson, what did that quote mean? So they sent him written interrogatories, and he had to answer in writing under oath. And here's what he wrote in 1946. If war did come, it was important from both the point of view of unified support of our own people as well as for the record of history that we should not be placed in the position of firing the first shot. If this could be done without sacrificing our safety, and here's the key phrase, but that Japan should appear in her true role as the aggressor. One problem troubled us very much. If you know your enemy is going to strike you, it is not usually wise to wait until he gets the jump on you by taking the initiative. In spite of the risk involved, however, in letting the Japanese fire the first shot, we realized that in order to have the full support of the American people, it was desirable to make sure that the Japanese be the ones to do this so that there would remain no doubt in anyone's mind as to who were the aggressors. And then he concludes by saying, we discussed at this meeting the basis upon which this country's position could be most clearly explained to our own people and to the world. So General Marshall has very similar language, which he gives to the Joint Congressional Committee. And one of these statements, which he made in 1945, was, quote, that the Japanese be given no opportunity whatever to claim that we had taken some overt act which forced a state of war upon them, end quote. Another statement Marshall made was that no matter how unjustified, he says, or illogical, if the Japanese could have led at least a portion of our people to believe that our overt action had forced them into an act of war, we would have had a divided country, which would have been a terrible tragedy in a war situation. Therefore, each move we made had to be taken carefully into account to avoid the possibility that the Japanese would instantly make a claim that we had forced the issue, that we had really made the overt act, and that they were forced to fight. He says, he goes on to say, so far as the war plan goes, the concern was whether or not the final alert should be given. It was accepted thought in all of our minds at the time that if we were forced to take offensive action, immediate offensive action, that it would be a most serious matter as to its interpretation by the American people, whether we would have a united nation or whether we would have a divided nation in getting into a world conflict. So this is the thinking of these high-level people, and maybe the best quote of all is Harry Hopkins, who is the unofficial deputy president. Officially, he was just the Secretary of Commerce, but he was the unofficial deputy president. Probably knew Roosevelt's mind better than anyone. And he wrote a memo the day of the Pearl Harbor attack after a meeting at 3:00 p.m. in Washington. A meeting by him, the president, and the heads of the military. He says, this is that day, he wrote, the conference met in not too tense an atmosphere because I think that all of us believe that in the last analysis the enemy was Hitler and that he could never be defeated without force of arms, that sooner or later we were bound to be in the war and that Japan had given us an opportunity, end quote. So this is the day that the Pacific Fleet gets lambasted by the Japanese. The damage is much worse than anyone thought would happen in such an event. And he says, but in the last analysis, the enemy was Hitler, and Japan had given us an opportunity. Then, just a month later, he writes a memo for the record. He's complaining about Secretary of State Hull, who never understood the problem that would have to be faced, quote, if Japan attacked, for instance, either Singapore or the Netherlands, East Indies, alone without attacking the United States. The President felt it a weakness in our foreign policy that we would not be specific on that point, end quote. And he says, I recall talking to the President many times in the past year, and it always disturbed him because he really thought that the tactics, and of course Hopkins should have said strategy, but Hopkins wrote that the tactics of the Japanese would be to avoid conflict with us, that they would not attack either the Philippines or Hawaii, but would move on Thailand, French Indochina, and make further inroads on China itself, and possibly attack the Malay Straits. This would have left the President with a very difficult problem of protecting our interest, end quote. He always realized that Japan would jump on us at an opportune moment and that they would merely use the one-by-one technique of Germany. Hence his great relief at the method that Japan used. In spite of the disaster at Pearl Harbor and the blitz warfare with the Japanese the first few weeks of the war, it completely solidified the American people, end quote. And of course we all know that's true. When President Roosevelt went before Congress the day after the Pearl Harbor attack, he did not request a declaration of war on Germany. He knew he didn't need to because he knew about Hitler's secret promise to Japan. He only requested a declaration of war on Japan, and 4 days later, Hitler followed through on his promise, as Roosevelt figured he would, and on December 11th, Hitler and Italy declared war on the U.S., and then the lineup was complete. And on that day, the fate of the Axis was doomed. It was just a matter of time, because, as I said earlier, the United States produced 47% of the world's war material, Germany 14%, Japan 3.5%. So I think your listeners your audience will understand by now that my argument is a nuanced one in the sense that the Japanese message that I believe was decrypted by the British and sent from Churchill to Roosevelt, we don't have a smoking gun in U.S. files that say, oh yeah, this message was broken by the British, or this message was broken by U.S. Navy codebreakers and shown to Roosevelt on this day. We don't have that. But we do have a formerly top-secret 1946 U.S. Navy report that admitted intercepting 26,000 Japanese Navy messages over a 3-month period before Pearl Harbor, and which admitted that 188 of them referred in one way or another to the forthcoming attack, and if somebody had had all those pieces of the puzzle, they would have known what was happening. Which also implies that we didn't receive that message of November 22nd, or the sailing order. But I'm just telling you, I don't believe it.
Right.
So it's a strong circumstantial case that I painted, and a nuanced case which involves a lot of diplomatics, a lot of the study of the diplomacy.
Well, now here's what I would like to ask you about this.
Okay.
So now that you've laid it all out, it seems like the idea of it being a surprise attack, a completely surprise attack, which is how it is still taught in schools, yes, seems to be an outlandish thought. Now, it seems yes, like there were quite a few people who, if they did not know Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor, they absolutely saw that Japan was preparing to attack at Pearl Harbor. But yes, what I want to know, and speaking of Harry Hopkins, is how many people do you think, because what you said earlier was that you don't think that Hull knew. So how many people do you think knew about FDR's intention to purposely draw Japan into the war? Was it just FDR? Was it FDR and Hopkins? Or
I love your question. I struggle with this and deal with it extensively in the volume 2 of my book. Most of my book is a chronology of what happened, when did it happen, what happened, and then remarks. But the last half of volume 2 or some extensive essays, and I go into this, and I have concluded that the only one I'm really not sure about, as far as not knowing, is Harry Hopkins, because he was deathly ill. You know, he lived in the White House.
Absolutely.
But at this time, that's how close he was to the president. But he had been in the hospital for a month, and he didn't come back to work until December the 4th. So it's possible he might not have known in advance, although he certainly didn't seem worried about it when he wrote his memos, and he seemed really tickled to death that the Japanese had been stupid enough to attack us directly instead of waiting for us to come attack them. The people I am convinced knew were General Marshall, the head of the U.S. Army, Admiral Stark, the head of the Navy, and probably the Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy. So that's Stimson, Henry Stimson, Frank Knox, General Marshall, Admiral Stark, and it has to include the head of ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence, Admiral Wilkinson, and it has to include Commander McCollum. By then he was a Navy captain, the man who wrote the provocative memo about trying to get Japan to commit an overt act of war back in October 1940. Because the Dutch naval attaché says he's at ONI, they're talking about the Japanese carriers near Hawaii, and that's the day before the attack, and he names them by name. The General Marshall, you know, is a sacred cow nowadays. I mean, nobody's allowed to say anything bad about General Marshall, but let me tell you something. The Army Pearl Harbor Board in 1944, during the war, published a very critical report about General Marshall in Pearl Harbor and blamed him for much of the responsibility. The Navy Court of Inquiry in 1944 absolved Admiral Kimmel of dereliction of duty and blamed Admiral Stark for many of the failures to notify. And of course the government hated that, so they went to extra efforts to try to discredit the Navy Court of Inquiry and to try to discredit the Army Pearl Harbor Board. But there are two people who dragged their feet and refused to give significant final warnings on the day of the attack, and that's Admiral Stark, head of the Navy, and General Marshall. So Admiral Stark was urged twice that morning to call Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii, because we were decoding the last. We were decoding. I didn't get into this, but we were decoding a long 14-part Japanese message, which was basically ending the negotiations. It wasn't declaring war, but it was ending the negotiations in a very final tone, with finality. And when we received the final part that morning and decoded got the magic decrypt, the diplomatic code breaking with the purple machine, we even knew what time they were supposed to deliver it in Washington, which was 1 o'clock p.m., which was the equivalent of 7:30 a.m. in Hawaii. And people urged him twice to call Admiral Kimmel, and he refused. Instead, he called the president. General Marshall, well, they asked Admiral Stark to send another Navy telegram, too, a Navy message, and he refused to do that and refused to call Kimmel. General Marshall dragged his feet all morning, made himself unavailable. People couldn't find him. He lied about being out riding his horse. He had somebody lie on his behalf. He wasn't riding his horse. He was in the War Department. As other people said, no, he was in his office reading these diplomatic telegrams at the time he said he was riding his horse. And then he delayed most of the morning, finally sent out a very watered-down warning, which didn't say much. It said diplomatic discussions are ending, be on the alert accordingly. And it was delivered late due to a bunch of screw-ups, and I think it arrived 7 hours after the attack. So these are two people, Stark and Marshall, who both lied about numerous things to Pearl Harbor investigations. It's acknowledged now by many historians that they lied their eyes out. And they both claimed to not remember where they were the night before the Pearl Harbor attack, which is not worthy of belief.
Right.
And I'll tell you where they were and why I think all these people knew.
Okay.
It's because Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox told one of his close associates, he was a Navy reservist, who was a Navy captain during the war in the reserves. He told Mr. Frank Stallman that he and Secretary of War Stimson and Marshall and Stark and others were in an all-night meeting at the White House, all night long, before the Pearl Harbor attack, waiting for the axe to fall. That people knew war with Japan was imminent. They just weren't sure where it was going to strike. That's the official version. But they claimed to have been in this all-night meeting with the president, with Hopkins, and so the heads of the Army and the Navy and their civilian bosses. And I believe that. Stallman wrote 2 letters about this, very detailed letters to people in the 1970s, quoting what Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox said. Well, unfortunately, Frank Knox died in 1943, so he died during the war. But his right-hand man gave us a gift to history and provided this information. And so I also believe Wilkinson knew, the head of O&I, and there's one other person I haven't mentioned, and I'll make him the last name I want to name that I feel sure knew. There was the head of Navy war plans was a horse's ass named Admiral Richmond K. Turner. Yeah, and of all, see, I view these men as loyal servants of the president carrying out the president's secret policy.
Absolutely.
And so I can't get as upset about them as a lot of people would. But there's one who's also a horse's ass, and that's Admiral Turner. His nickname was Terrible Turner. He was a bully. He basically rode roughshod over 3 directors of the Office of Naval Intelligence, wouldn't let them notify anybody in the Navy about analyses. He reserved all that right to himself. He made some amazing statements which practically admit foreknowledge under oath in 1944. This is my last quotes that I'm going to read tonight. It's a good way to end my discussion of who knew because they're really provocative. So this is before the Navy Court of Inquiry in 1944. And by this time, Turner is a 4-star admiral, and he's in charge of all our amphibious invasions, and he has to go back to the U.S. and testify, right? And so here's the question. Did you think that Japan would launch an air attack against the Hawaiian Islands? Answer, I thought it was one of the possibilities. Question, did you think it was a probability? Yes. Were you surprised on the morning of the 7th of December when Japan made an air attack on the Hawaiian Islands? Not in the least, he says. This is under oath. Not in the least.
Wow.
The question, in other words, you felt an air attack was coming about that date? He says, I knew our carriers were out, and with the warnings which had been given, I felt we would give them a pretty bad beating before they got home, end quote. In other words, yes, we had sent the 2 carriers in Hawaii to sea to deliver airplanes to Wake and Midway. And he says, I knew our carriers were out, and I thought we'd give them a pretty good beating on the way home. In other words, this implies they weren't allowed to attack them beforehand, because that was clearly their policy. Japan had to fire the first shot, commit the first overt act. So he says, we would have gotten them on the way home. His final statement under oath here on this one slide I've made for my class is, quote, a specific warning against a particular thing at that time was against policy, and I agree with that policy, end quote. So that's Richmond K. Turner.
Wow.
So when I think without repeating myself anymore, I think at least your audience has some idea of why I say the leadership knew. Stimson, Knox, Marshall, Stark, Turner, and Wilkinson, and McCollum. And it's remarkable to me how frank General Marshall was and Secretary of War Stimson were in their testimonies in 44 and 45 about how this was going to affect the way our people perceived the war and whether we had a divided or a united country, and how we couldn't do anything that would allow the Japanese to blame the start of the war on us.
Right.
So, I mean, that's about as much of an admission as you're going to get without going to jail.
Right.
No.
Right. So, as a former history teacher, I've read quite a few mainstream historians, and these are the historians that are lauded by the publishing houses and by the media. Yet they almost to a man agree that FDR did not have foreknowledge of Pearl Harbor. So if it's true that he did know, why do they keep perpetuating this lie that he did not know?
I think this troubles me a lot too, and I think they deny it for the same reason that mainstream historians deny that there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy and a cover-up of that by the government.
Right.
I think they're obsessed with maintaining and upholding faith in government institutions, quote unquote. And I think to these people who are such an integral part of the establishment, I'm talking about mainstream journalists and mainstream historians and textbook writers, I think they view this as some kind of a holy responsibility or holy mission that they have to uphold. And of course, the problem with that mindset is that if you're trying to uphold faith in institutions by telling lies, then the faith in the institutions is on a foundation of sand. And when people begin to realize that it's a pack of lies, the faith in institutions erodes that much faster, and the erosion is that much deeper. So I just think that there's a lot of willful denial going on, and a pack mentality consensus also amongst these people.
Well, the last question I have for you tonight is this. FDR is still ranked highly by historians in modern polls. However, do you believe that the Pearl Harbor story, and by that I mean the real Pearl Harbor story that you've told us about tonight, tarnishes his image?
I'm going to give you a nuanced answer to that one. It's a very good question, and I of course, I have to answer it. Here's my answer. If you are a pacifist and you're opposed to war of any kind for any reason, and you're a pacifist to the bone, then yes, it will tarnish his reputation for you, certainly. If you study history, as I do, through the lens of realpolitik, which is not through the lens of our national myths and what we want to believe about ourselves, but through the lens of what really happened in incident A, B, and C, what really happened, and why did it happen, and what were the real motivations for people doing what they did, as opposed to the public smokescreen that politicians give people. If you're a student of realpolitik, then I came to this. I still admire Roosevelt tremendously. I came to this subject as a great admirer of Franklin Roosevelt, and unlike most revisionist historians about Pearl Harbor, unlike most revisionists, I leave the writing of my book still admiring Roosevelt. I don't hate Roosevelt, and I do not condemn him as a warmonger, because I am absolutely persuaded that without the American participation in World War II, for the 3.5 years we were in it, that, to put it simply, the bad guys might have won. The brutality and cruelty of the Nazi Germany regime and of Imperial Japan was so unbelievable and so horrific that if they had won World War II, the whole world would have turned into a slaughterhouse and a charnel house. And what happened in the Holocaust to Jewish people and gypsies and homosexuals would have been repeated all over the world in times 100. And what happened in the rape of Nanking, where the Japanese army, out of control, raped something like 80,000 women and murdered 300,000 civilians, something like that. The numbers are under dispute, but they killed a lot of innocent people. That would have continued throughout the Pacific and elsewhere. And so I know that Joseph Stalin told Harry Hopkins in 1941. You know, Harry Hopkins made his first visit to Russia right before the Argentia conference. So he came over on the Prince of Wales with Churchill. He sailed over with Churchill, and he went over to meet with Roosevelt before Roosevelt met Churchill at that conference. And Hopkins relayed Stalin's request that the U.S. enter the war as soon as possible, because he said, Stalin told Hopkins, the Soviet Union, as resilient as we are, the Soviet Union and Great Britain together, we cannot defeat Nazi Germany. We need the United States to enter the war. So that's how I see it. And no war is glorious, but some wars are certainly necessary, and I think this was the ultimate necessary war. I don't feel that way about any wars since the Second World War. I'm very critical of American foreign policy since that time, but I think this was the necessary war, and so for that reason, I think because Roosevelt was faced with choices that were bad and others that were much worse, I think he did the best he could in those difficult circumstances.
And now, is there somewhere that people can go to read your work online?
Sure. I have a blog site, which I'll speak very slowly. Maybe you can put it up online. It's
I sure will.
Yeah, inside the ARRB.livejournal.com. So there's no at. It's inside the ARRB.livejournal.com, and there are many, many entries about my book inside the Assassination Records Review Board, my 5-volume book about the JFK cover-up, medical cover-up. And then there were not many entries for a while, and recently I've made a few entries about my new book here about FDR and Pearl Harbor, with some links to other interviews and with some links to FDR speeches. So that's where they can check things out. And I know I've gone way over your normal program limit, ST, but it's been a real pleasure, and I thank you for the opportunity.
And thank you. This has been Doug Horne, author of Deception, Intrigue, and the Road to War. Thanks, Doug.
Okay, thank you. Take care.
I'm ST Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back with some final thoughts. We want to thank Doug Horne again for being on the show. It took us a while to find him, so we appreciate the opportunity, and we appreciate the time he made for us and for you. We feel immensely more educated on the subject of FDR and Pearl Harbor, and we hope that you do too. You know, the remember whens of our lives all seem centered around disasters. Generations have been asked, do you remember where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor being attacked? Do you remember where you were when JFK was assassinated? And do you remember where you were on September 11th, 2001? Ironically, and sadly, these are all historical events mired in controversy, state corruption, and in ways direct and indirect, war. Pearl Harbor has even become a term used as an action. When someone Pearl Harbors someone else, it means that they attacked the other by surprise. A surprise attack. Well, from what we learned tonight, Pearl Harbor was not a surprise attack. Even if you believe FDR did not intentionally drop diplomatic-based crumbs leading the Japanese straight to the shores of Hawaii, it seems that American intelligence absolutely knew beforehand. Pearl Harbor was an event that even mainstream historians agree led us into World War II. The death of President John F. Kennedy spiraled us deeper into Vietnam, and September 11th quickly turned public opinion in favor of wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq. It seems that Americans are prone to being scared and angered into war. As the masses scream, "Make us secure," the war machine marches full steam into the next multi-billion or multi-trillion-dollar fiasco. Lives lost, valuable dollars spent, and generations irreversibly changed in ways that will forever remain undone. Someday I hope to ask you an even greater remember when question. Remember when we lived unafraid of the next disaster? Remember when a generation of teenagers and young adults didn't have to go to war to enrich the lowest aims of politicians? Remember when a country's self-image was entrenched in its right and not in its might? Remember when there was peace? From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with ST Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to ST Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com, and be sure to visit midnightridernews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.